Coming up, how America goes to war.
If there were a new way, a new guideline, a new understanding of the way in which you go to war, we'd all be much, much better off.
Legendary journalist Marvin Kalb explains how presidential commitments have led the U.S. to war and urges a change to the system. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker today is a legendary journalist, Marvin Kalb. Many of you may remember this award-winning reporter and commentator who appeared on CBS and NBC News, including a stint on Meet the Press. It has been said that he covered the news at a time when news was really news. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome him here to discuss his latest and most timely of books entitled The Road to War, Presidential Commitments Honored and Betrayed.
I covered the Vietnam War. I'm old enough to have covered the Vietnam War. And while I was in Vietnam and trying to cover a very complex story, there was a question that kept coming to my mind, and that was, how did it work out? How did it happen that here I am covering a war in which 562,000 American troops have been sent to a rather small country in Southeast Asia? By what authority? Well, the president sent them here. Well, what authority did he have to do this? And under what circumstances? And I began then to ask questions of ambassadors who represented the United States at that time in Vietnam. And I would be going back and forth, so there'd be a couple of them. And more important to me, the generals who were ordering the troops here and there, what did they think? And it was very interesting to get a difference of perspective, which was natural, between a diplomat and a general, but both were puzzled about how the U.S. got into this entanglement. How did it happen? Up until World War II, this country had a reasonably understood system, a widely understood system. The Congress had certain responsibilities and the president had others. The Congress's responsibilities were first to declare war, and second, to provide the money to fight a war. The president, as commander-in-chief, had other responsibilities, but the two of them came together. And when both sides, the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government, felt that they were following the common interests of the nation, which is not necessarily true today, as I think we all recognize. But at a time when that did happen and was consistent with American policy, there was no conflict, because both sides essentially had the same idea about the threat to America's security interests and what each side could do to protect the nation. And there were 5 times in American history when declarations of war were proclaimed. And the first one goes back to 1812, the Brits, 1846, Mexicans, 1898, Spanish, World War I and World War II. Since World War II, the United States, as we know, has been involved in one war after another. And if you begin to explore the reasons why we got into each one of these wars, there are specific reasons and then there are overarching reasons. And one of the overarching reasons was that after World War II, we suddenly found ourselves in a nuclear world. And that had a profound effect upon policymaking, because people in Congress felt that this was a decision. If you go to war and if you may have to use nuclear weapons, that's a big-time decision. And we'll let the president handle that. And we will deal with our responsibilities, like legislation, and there's a large responsibility to make sure the proper laws are passed for this nation. That started as a trickle, but began to become a flow as we got into just the pre-9/11 period, but certainly post-9/11. A second factor was the rise of the Cold War. And in the midst of the Cold War, our thinking became overly simplified. If the Russians were in favor of something, we generally opposed it, and vice versa. And if the Russians were making a move into Latin America, we had to block it. It wasn't that we had to block it for reasons that related to specific American interests, except in that broad context of the Cold War. When you think about the Vietnam War, which to me is almost the beginning and the end of so much, Harry Truman did not get us involved in Vietnam because he was interested in Vietnam. He barely knew where it was on a map. And by the way, he was not alone. Most people in Washington didn't know where it was, except in 1949, the Chinese went communist, and suddenly there was this image in Washington, anyway, looking out at the rest of the world, of everything turning red. The Russians were the Soviet Union, and then China, and then there were moves on the part of communist parties in different parts of the world in what we considered to be threats to America's security interests. Truman began to send $150 million in military supplies to the good guys in Vietnam, starting in the late 1940s. Why? It had nothing to do with Vietnam. It had everything to do with Europe and everything to do with where the French were. There was, as some of you may remember, a vigorous French Communist Party after World War II. And in the 1948 elections, they won 42% of the vote. That was a big deal. And in Washington, there was a great fear that France, too, would go communist. And you remember that Stalin was moving his empire further westward. So there was a preoccupation in Washington about Europe, about Stalin, about the Soviet Union. Nobody was thinking of Vietnam, except the French, who wanted to reimpose colonial rule in Indochina. We were opposed to the reimposition of colonial rule, but we were more concerned about keeping France in NATO and very much committed to an anti-communist position. And so, if the French came to us and said, hey, help us out a little bit, will you? We did. And so the 150 million, more or less at the beginning, spread to 500 million. And then when Eisenhower came in 1954, there was the Geneva Convention on Indochina. And Eisenhower was very reluctant as a general to get any kind of military involvement in Indochina. He wanted no part of it. But what he did want was to make sure that the peace of Vietnam, south of the 17th parallel, that we christened South Vietnam, remained anti-communist, part of the free world. And as part of the free world, Eisenhower was determined to make sure that that corner of the world remained non-communist. Now, what did that mean? That meant that by the tail end of the 1950s, we were beginning to send advisors, military advisors, to help. In 1954, the French were effectively militarily defeated. And could the United States simply leave this infant South Vietnam alone? No, we could not. Eisenhower said in 1959 at a speech at Gettysburg College, and I'm going to give you something that's awfully close to an exact word for word. The future of a non-communist, independent South Vietnam is in the direct security interests of the United States. So when President Kennedy comes in, a young, relatively inexperienced president, and sits down on January 19, 1961, with the outgoing Republican president, the last of the 19th century presidents, by the way, to the first of the 20th century presidents. Kennedy was listening very carefully, and Eisenhower said to him at a private meeting, "You're going to have a couple of problems, young Mr. President. Among them is Indochina." And that breaks down, as you know, there's Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. In Laos, the communists are doing bad things. They are really moving in. And the Vietnamese are helping them. So I tell you, JFK, to consider Laos a security interest of the United States, requiring a Western military commitment to its defense. If you can get our allies to join us, great. But if you cannot, then we have to do it on our own. Is that understood? And there was then in Geneva a Laos conference, and Averell Harriman, who was in charge of that, was simply too shrewd and too experienced to get sucked into a situation where the United States would have to send troops to Laos. Harriman just didn't think that made any sense and persuaded Kennedy, to Kennedy's credit, not to think about Laos as a military problem, but as a diplomatic problem. And if we can neutralize Laos, that's much better than sending troops there. And that's what we did. But very much with Eisenhower's admonition still in mind, Kennedy switched from Laos to Vietnam. And what he told his security people is that we can neutralize Laos, we cannot lose South Vietnam. And then he picked up Eisenhower's comments of '59 and pointed to them and said, hey, look, we are committed. That's a great word, by the way, in the American diplomatic lexicon. Whenever you hear presidents talk about our commitment, watch your wallet, because something dramatic is going to take place. Sometimes it's underhanded and sometimes it's straight out. But when the United States of America is committed to something, that's a big deal. And it takes on political implications and it takes on economic, but more than anything, the national being of the United States is involved in something. And if a nation has an ego, the United States had a huge ego, and commitments meant force. And when Kennedy was killed and Johnson came over, he turned to one of his key people and a young writer in Texas named Ronnie Duggan and said to him, when you write about me, you write about me as one big, tough Texan. And I'm not like those boys from Massachusetts, who play around with words and things. I'm tough. That's the way we Texans are. So put the word out. I am not going to be the first president to lose a war, point number one. I am not going to be the president to see Indochina go down the drain, point number two. And so when people like me began to go there and cover that war, we suddenly found ourselves caught up in something that was not born of a conscious commitment based upon an analysis of why the United States must send 500,000 soldiers to South Vietnam. It simply emerged as a result of a series of words, commitments, actions, the Cold War, the belief that you had to stop the communists from taking any additional real estate around the world because it was considered that their win is our loss. We could not tolerate that. So you find yourself involved in a series of situations where the United States of America simply has, for the last 70 years, found itself in one of these wars after another. Increasingly finds itself absorbed now with fundraising. Bear in mind the figure 50 to 70%. Senator Daschle, when he was in office, and he's no longer there, Senator Daschle said that our meaning politicians, we are now spending, he said, 50 to 70% of every single day getting money. Now think about this. If that is the case, how much is left to do legislation? How much is left to be serious about issues involving the interests of the nation? Not that much. Some, but not that much. presidents then began, almost by default, to pick up what became a singular, almost a sole responsibility for checking out the world and determining that that country over there must be protected. That one over there, we're going to send some troops to. This one over there, we cannot allow the communists to take over. And it was a presidential decision. And so the National Security Council, which under Eisenhower consisted of 4 people, today has quite literally dozens. It's a slightly smaller State Department that is now at the White House. And decisions that used to be State Department decisions are now definitely White House decisions. And everything has accumulated with just this immense increasing power of the White House, of the presidency. And so the president can now determine that the U.S. has to fight in X, Y, or Z, and the Congress either says nothing or will pat the president on the back with a resolution of support, or every now and then, as happened in 1990, the tail end of it, 1990 and early 1991, there was a genuine discussion in the Senate about whether the United States should send troops into Kuwait. And it was a 5-vote difference at the end in the Senate, 52-47 vote. 3 guys changed their minds, and it would have gone the other way. Let's jump ahead to Syria. The president decides to attack after learning about the gas attacks in Syria, that he's going to launch an attack on Syria. Then he decides that he's going to go to Congress.
Seek authorization for the use of force from the American people's representatives in Congress.
Now, here I want to put in a large paren. And the way in which policy works in Washington, it is an extremely capricious, uncharted territory sometimes. But the role of think tanks in Washington in terms of influencing policy has become extremely large. And I'm associated with Brookings, which is a very good, middle-of-the-road, slightly left think tank. When I did this book, and the first copies began to be circulated, because I've been around Washington for a while and not totally unknown, a couple of friends of mine distributed the book to 3 people at the National Security Council. Here, as a reporter, I have to tell you that I cannot vouch for anything that I'm about to say. That I am simply told this, but I have no way of knowing if it's true. The 3 of them at meetings began to talk about the theme of this book, which is that a nation such as the United States of America ought to have an agreed upon, understood set of guidelines for going to war. It should not be a capricious operation. It should not be something left in the hands of a president to sort of figure out more or less what he wants, with or without congressional approval, that there ought to be a system set up that a president understands and the Congress understands and the American people understand is the way we go to war. Some not rigid system, but understood system. And that word did get to the president, I'm told, and that did contribute to his decision to go to Congress. Close paren on this. He did go to Congress, and we all know what happened. Congress, without a vote, indicated very strongly they wanted no part of it. Okay. Now, this is where a central issue comes into play. And let us say Congress says no, and the president says, I am committed. I am personally committed, and therefore this country is committed, and we have to attack. Do we talk about impeachment? This is an issue, it seems to me anyway, of such paramount importance on an issue of war and peace that we must begin to think seriously about a way for all of us to have a discussion about this issue and to come up with a formula that is acceptable to the majority of the American people, and even more important than that, acceptable to the people who make decisions about war or peace, namely first the president and then the Congress, and somewhere down the line, the American people. Thank you all very much for listening.
You mentioned the number of times that the Congress has declared war, but of course there are other instances, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and resolutions before the invasion of Kuwait and before the invasion of Iraq, where Congress has authorized the president to take military action. Now, they didn't use the term declaration of war, but they did authorize the president to take military action. Why, in your view, does that comport with the constitutional requirement for the declaration of war by Congress?
An answer requires a definition of declaration of war and what it entails. The last time it was used, in December of 1941.
A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
Roosevelt did not go to Congress just to get a pat on the back. Roosevelt went to Congress to nationalize an effort to defeat the Japanese. In other words, a declaration of war is a cri de coeur. It is a cry from the heart to the entire nation that we are now committed to war, and we've got to do something about it, and we've got to win. It was a national effort, not a couple of guys banding together to do what it is that they thought was in the national interest of the country. We have to bear a statistic in mind to understand this point. We now have an all-volunteer military. The all-volunteer military in the United States represents 0.6% of the American people. 99.4% of the American people live behind the shield provided by 0.6%. And those two worlds find themselves today with a deeper chasm between them. A declaration of war would mean that the 99.4% also has to get into the act.
Does the president have too much power in the system? And if so, how exactly would you constrain his power? Is the Obama model of going to Congress for something such as the Syria strike the way of the future in your judgment?
Yes, I believe that the president does have too much power, but at the same time, where else can you go? He is the president. We don't have a countervailing force. When the president went to Congress, that was not what he wanted to do. He went there because he felt suddenly that the floor under him was collapsing and that his support wasn't there. And he was looking for support. He thought, misled by some of the Democrats in Congress, into believing that the Congress would support him in his Syria plans. They didn't. And that's when Putin rode to the rescue. But where do you turn? In the Constitution as set up, there's only one other place, and that's Congress. And that's my essential point, that if there were a new way, a new guideline, a new understanding of the way in which you go to war, we'd all be much, much better off. Then we would not be in a position of allowing, in effect, the adversary to determine our response to a certain challenge. We would know in advance how we're going to deal with something, and then you deal with it depending on what the challenge happens to be. But at this particular point, we don't have that, and that's why we are trapped with words like commitment, and we believe, and the president is understood to feel. All this phraseology covers up the failure of the system to come in with a clean, clear understanding of ways in which this country goes to war. It was always assumed when the language of the Constitution was written that we're all going to be on the same page. I remember as a Moscow correspondent during the Cold War, I served there for 5 years. I say this not with pride at all. As a matter of fact, with a little bit of embarrassment now. But as a CBS correspondent in Moscow during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I shared with the embassy information that I picked up along the way. And they gave me information that I could not get otherwise. Did they give me what I wanted? Oh, no, not at all. They gave me what they wanted me to put out. I'm aware of that. Why did I share my stuff? Because I felt we were all in it together. That the American journalists and the American government didn't want the communists to win. That's what it comes down to. And I repeat, I say that with some embarrassment because that's not pure journalism. Right now, it seems as if journalists get a special kind of ego boost out of tricking the government and finding the government in some kind of bad play. When the government deserves it, go to it, but it doesn't deserve it as often as it gets it.
Well, thank you so much for...
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.